Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third academic panel at this year's Belgrade Security Forum 2017 academic event. I am Marko Kovačević and I will be moderating this very interesting panel that is titled The EU as a Crisis Management Actor, CSDP in the Neighborhood. This panel will analyze the EU missions in Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Somalia, the occupied Palestinian territories in order to discuss the issues of local ownership in peacekeeping missions, the planning capacity of CSDP missions, missing elements in the EU missions, as well as how the EU missions might aid and abet our authoritarianism. It is a great pleasure to introduce our panelists today, and I'm just going to briefly announce them. With us here today is Dr. Filip Ejdus, who is a Marie Curie Fellow at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol until just maybe 2 weeks ago, and Filip has returned to Belgrade after 2 years at the University of Bristol, and now is assistant professor at the Faculty of Political Sciences, University of Belgrade, continuing his teaching at the University of Belgrade. Most recently, some of Filip's work has been published in the European Security, the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, the Journal of International Relations and Development, and Southeast European and Black Sea Studies. Today we'll have a chance to hear more about his work in the area of CSDP and missions. Also with us here today is Ivana Boštjančič Pulko, who is a PhD candidate, and she graduated with a degree in international relations from the University of Ljubljana, and currently she is a project manager and researcher at the Center for European Perspective, responsible for overall implementation of security sector reform projects in the countries of the Western Balkans in the framework of Slovenia's official development assistance. Dr. Annemarie Peen Rodt is associate professor at the Institute for Strategy, Royal Danish Defense College. Her research appraises strategic approaches to the protection of civilians in peace operations and crisis management, primarily in wider Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Alaa Tartir is the program director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, as well as a research associate at the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. As our discussant today, we have Dr. Vladimir Ateljević, who is currently the advisor to the Minister for EU Integration and a member of the Serbian EU accession negotiating team. Within the team, he is in charge of chapters 30, External Relations, and 31, Foreign Security and Defense Policy. Mr. Ateljević graduated from the Faculty of Political Sciences at the University of Belgrade, where he completed both his MA and PhD thesis. Without further ado, I suggest to the panelists to use 12 minutes to present their work, and then we can proceed with the Q&A, with the first discussants' comments, and afterwards with the Q&A during this session. I yield the floor to Filip Ejdus to present the paper titled Local Ownership as International Governmentality, Evidence from the EU Mission in the Horn of Africa.
Thank you, Marko. Thanks to the organizers, and I'm part of the organization as well, for putting up this panel and the conference today. It is my great pleasure to be here with you today to present my results from my Marie Curie project, which allowed me to spend 2 years in Bristol and study local ownership in CSDP missions. And in particular, I looked at 3 missions in my project, which is EULEX, Kosovo. Then I looked at EUPOl COPS, and together with Dr. Tartir, I co-authored one paper on that subject, but he's going to more focus on Palestine in his presentation. And the third mission, which I looked at in my project, is EUCAP Nestor in the Horn of Africa. And in my presentation, I will provide illustrations from the third mission, from Somalia and from the Horn of Africa. And basically, my entire project started off with a general assumption that over the past 20 years or so, there has been a fundamental shift in policy discourse of international peace building and state building interventions towards local ownership. Local ownership has become a veritable orthodoxy of international interventions. Everyone agrees that the interventions need to be locally owned, but there is very little work on what actually local ownership means in practice. Why is it so important for international interventions? How is it operationalized on the ground? Through what techniques, technologies, and everyday practices? And finally, maybe most importantly, it's why local ownership has been the weakest link in international interventions. So the empirical record, and this is not stemming from my own research, but from literature review, shows that local ownership has been one of the really the weakest spots of international interventions, not only the EU missions, but also UN and many other external interventions in state building, peace building, security sector reform. So the failure to implement local ownership on the ground has really been all-pervasive. So the question is why? Why is this so? So I pose those three questions, and I make three basic arguments. I will make those three arguments here briefly, and I will provide a few illustrations for each. So the first question is why local ownership as a principle of international interventions appears at the turn of the century, so 1999, 2000. When you Google local ownership in peace building, before 1999, you won't find any references whatsoever. Maybe in development policy, yes, but in peace building, state building interventions, it really comes to the radar in the early 2000s, and in the past 5 or 6 years, there's a veritable explosion of interest for the local. There's even a local turn in peace-building studies, and all missions claim to at least try to achieve local ownership on the ground. So I argue that the political rationality behind the emergence of this principle is the rationality of the interveners, not the rationality of the locals. And that this political rationality echoes concerns of the late colonial Western powers who switched from a principle of direct rule of their colonies at the beginning of 19th century to a more indirect rule in the second half, especially after the Indian Mutiny of the 19th century, because they realized that it was impractical and impossible to westernize and to directly control colonial possessions. So they switched to a more kind of indirect rule and to a light footprint, the rule through the local princes, through autonomy of the colonized. Now, I'm not saying that local ownership is a neo-colonial continuation of the old times. I'm just saying that after the failures of the international community to build and erect Western liberal states in some countries that were under the international interventions, most importantly Bosnia, Kosovo, but later on Iraq and Afghanistan, the international community realized increasingly that the erection of liberal states, fully fledged liberal states, is impossible, and there needs to be a local agency, a local autonomy, and if that means diversion from the original kind of model of liberal state, that's fine as long as it's sustainable and holds local traction. In EUCAP Nestor, it's an excellent example. The intervention per se started not on the behalf of the local needs and interests. The EU intervened on behalf of EU commercial interests in the Gulf of Aden. to fight piracy, which was, as it was stated in one of the previous panels, from the Somali point of view, was a legitimate response to illegal fishing off the coast of Somalia. So from the point of view of the locals, the intervention didn't make that much sense. Local ownership as a principle of this intervention was also based on the rationality of the EU, not on the rationality of those who are at the receiving end of the intervention. Local ownership was simply introduced, or tried to be introduced, as a way of achieving sustainability for reforms which are important from the point of view of European geostrategic and economic interests. Now, in the second part of my paper, I study how is this principle of local ownership being operationalized on the ground. Is it pure rhetoric, as some authors argue, that serves only to legitimize international interventions, or it's a principle which structures practices? And I observed, not only in Somalia, where I did field work, but also in Palestine and in Kosovo, that local ownership principle is more than mere rhetoric. It does structure, shapes, interventionist practices. And I argue that it is operationalized through the technology of responsibilization, which means a transfer of responsibility from the international community to the locals for the implementation of externally designed goals and objectives of missions. And this technology of responsibilization is further detailed in a number of different techniques, such as mentoring, monitoring, evaluation, trainings, key leadership engagement, and joint planning. Now, given the fact that the very rationality behind both interventions and local ownership is based on the rationality of those who intervene from the global north, rather than those who are on the receiving end in the global south and in conflict-affected states, this responsibilization is an outside-in and top-down endeavor, and is not based, usually, in most cases, on genuine interests and needs of those who are on the receiving end. I will just give you one example: joint action planning. That's one of the techniques which is practiced not only in the Horn of Africa, but also in Kosovo. We have joint coordination boards. We have joint meetings of the EU and the local authorities who jointly plan what the objectives and the tasks of the mission are going to be. Now, when you read the joint action plan signed between the EU and the government of Somaliland from 2014, you read that, I quote, it was a bottom-up approach, yet fully aligned with Somaliland's vision. However, when you interview both EU officials and Somali Coast Guard officers, you very soon realize that there was very little jointly agreed tasks and objectives in this endeavor. I will just quote one Somaliland's official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He says, I quote, "In the process of drafting the joint action plan, EUCAP was in the driving seat. It was based on how they wanted to assist us. It was basically a plan of their activities." End of quote. The same logic behind this technique of responsibilization was shared by by EU officials, sorry. And I will just quote you one interview that I had with one of the top level officials in this mission. He says, "I was the pen holder of the joint action plan. When I presented them the draft and the methodology behind the document, they were more than happy with that. Themselves not able to make additions, not only because of limitations in their command of English language, but also due to their inability to master the intricacies of maritime security." End of quote. I mean, it's important a little bit to contextualize this mission. Somaliland's Coast Guard, until recently, didn't have a headquarters. They didn't have the building. Many of them, or most of them, don't know how to swim, or didn't know until recently. They don't have basic preconditions to have a Coast Guard. And with the help of EUCAP and other donors, they're trying to build those capacities. Now, that having being said, that the political rationality of local ownership is based on the rationality of the interveners, and that it is operationalized through the technique of responsibilization of the locals, I wanted to know and to understand why the locals resist, to assume ownership over those externally designed objectives. And with this section, I will finish. So I argue in my paper that because the principle is based on this alien governmentality. I won't bore you with governmentality studies and the work of Michel Foucault, but this is theoretical background of my work. Because of this alien governmentality that echoes a late colonial principle of indirect rule, and because of the way it is being operationalized as an externally driven top-down process of responsibilization, local population and local authorities simply engage in various forms of either direct or indirect resistance, not necessarily resistance. Of course, there is a lot of work that the locals do together with the internationals, but at least in this particular case, the locals engage in the various forms of direct and indirect resistance to the objectives and the tasks that the EU tried to responsibilize them with. And interestingly enough, the cases and the instances of direct resistance are rather rare. What is much more interesting, at least theoretically, but I also think practically and politically, is this so-called infra-politics or everyday resistance of the locals to whatever the EU is trying to achieve. So formally, the Somalis will tell you, yes, 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 please come work with us. We agree with everything that you bring, because you bring resources, you bring knowledge, and we issue an invitation to the EU to come and teach us how to have a coast guard. But then, on an everyday level, the locals they for instance drag their feet with the adoption of various laws. There was a draft law on Coast Guard which was made by the EU years ago, and it hasn't been passed by the local parliament. And when you speak to the EU and ask them, so why the locals didn't pass the law, they will give you a whole bunch of official storylines why the law hasn't been passed. But when you dig a little bit deeper and scratch the surface, you realize that there is a very concrete reason why this particular law has not been adopted. And the reason is that the law did not reflect the interests and the needs of the local population. One example from this law, according to the European best standards, the Coast Guard is under the Ministry of Interior. It has some sort of autonomy, and it has some police powers. They have to police Somali waters. However, in the Somali kind of tradition, and according to the Somali kind of balance of power, current balance of power in the government, nobody wanted to have, first of all, Coast Guard, which belongs to the Ministry of Interior. They wanted to have a militarized Coast Guard. That's one, because that's a nucleus of their potentially future navy. Second, they didn't want to have a Coast Guard which was autonomous, slightly autonomous from the minister, because the minister is the strong man and he wants to have a full control. And third of all, they didn't want to have a Coast Guard with the police powers, because they already have other institutions with police powers. So they put it in the drawer and they find ever new and creative justifications for not adopting. And also there are, in addition to infra-political and kind of indirect forms of resistance, which are extremely interesting, there are also instances of direct resistance when the government simply sent a letter to the EU saying, look, enough is enough, you're not helping us, this is not going the way it should, and please replace the person at the top, and let's find another kind of modus operandi. To conclude, I argue that the principle of ownership essentially is not grounded in rationality of those who are on the receiving end, that it echoes late colonial attempts of Western former colonial powers to control at a distance their colonial possessions and their populations. It is operationalized through techniques of responsibilization that aim to keep the power to decide on the objectives of the interventions in the hands of internationals, while transferring responsibility for their outcomes and implementation to the locals. And this alien and distant governmentality gave rise and gives rise, I think, across CSDP and UN interventions to various forms of resistance that prevent higher degrees of local participation. And that's why locals do not own international interventions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Filip, for presenting us your research on this very interesting topic. And I would like to now yield the floor to Ms. Ivana Boštjančič Pulko from Center for European Perspective to present her work titled Evaluating Planning Capacity of CSDP Missions, the Case of EULEX Kosovo and EUFOR Althea.
Thank you very much. Hello. I would also like to greet everybody on behalf of our project, because I'm representing another Horizon 2020 project here today. It's called IEC-EU, Improving the Effectiveness of Capabilities in EU Conflict Prevention. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me and accepting my paper. And it's also very nice to see that such a large crowd is interested in CSDP. I would also like to use this opportunity because with another consortium called WASCAP, we are organizing a final conference because our project is ending soon on the 8th of November in Brussels. So if you have time in Scotland House, you're kindly invited. It will be very interesting to see the opinions of the researcher academics, but also the representatives of the EEAS and the member states. Because through our research, if I quote an EEAS representative, he said, EU is simply not made for CSDP. And also we realized, assessing the two Balkan missions, namely EULEX and EUFOR Althea, that CSDP is positioned very low on the political agendas of the member states. So because Slovenia is a small country and we cooperate closely with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it is actually very nice to see that they invited us for a joint brainstorming, and they said they would like to hear some fresh ideas maybe from the researchers, which might help them for maybe some kind of a new breakthrough on the strategic level. But anyhow, on a more positive note, I think we realize that it's actually in the given circumstances quite remarkable what, for example, EULEX managed to achieve. My paper is building on the work which was actually done, led by Dr. Rodt, who is sitting there, from the University of Ljubljana. And it will focus on the planning capacity of CSDP mission. I will explain a little bit on methodology as well, and then some lessons learned and recommendations from our research. So just a few lines on planning. We believe that planning is very important because it considerably influences the possible success of the mission in the future. And the planning process is actually key to understanding how an operation works, because it's a conceptual bridge between the political aims and the objectives on the strategic level on one side, and then the operational means and resources on the other side. And when we say planning capacity, we didn't just look into the planning dynamic governed in the decision-making running up to the launch of the operation or the mission, but also then the implementation of the mission, the maintaining of political oversight by means of periodic mission reviews. We have heard about that a couple of times already today, and lesson learned process. So we consider that as part of the planning process as well. As you are probably aware, crisis response planning is a multi-layered process within the EU. And so at the political strategic level of the Brussels institutions, the political authorities define in clearly defined consecutive steps. No presentation, we are not putting that on any slide because it looks terrible, it's so complicated. But in clearly defined consecutive steps, the broad outlook of the operation, how it should look like, etc. And then this guidance from above is then translated into plans, with increased levels of detail. So these documents that are leading then to the operational plan are really detailed. So what we argue in our research that actually both missions achieved a somewhat satisfactory level in their planning capacities, which is of course also based on what are our expectations towards that. And maybe my large lesson learned within this research was also we really need to discuss what are our expectations within the CSDP, because it seems like the structures are working well and the processes as well, but they are rather slow. So if it takes 2 years to set up a mission or an operation, that's a very subjective thing, whether that's too slow or is quick enough, etc. And of course, there's a lot of room for improvement and many challenges remain, especially, we believe, at the level of the member states' decision making. So just as a context, both missions were planned at the time when EU was on its peak. So it was also, the Balkans was somehow a testing ground for the EU, and also because of the proximity of the region, and EU was testing slightly what can it achieve through CSDP, and they were both very, very ambitious. And that's why it's also interesting now with smaller missions being planned to research those really the most ambitious, largest one, also with an executive mandate, which is really important. Our methodology consisted of field trips to Kosovo and Bosnia. We conducted around 70 interviews, and then we also had a focus group discussion. Some of you here participated in this discussion in Ljubljana. Yeah, because we need to understand that EU missions are political missions with an operational mandate. Large focus of our project was actually assessing the effectiveness of that technical part of the mission, so the operational part. But within the planning, we were also assessing the EU structural decision making. And when generally comparing CSDP maybe to the other models of crisis prevention in other organizations, it is sort of clear that there is a much more extensive political approval process within CSDP, and we feel that maybe this political oversight is going into too much details, and the member states are therefore a huge showstopper for a better implementation and planning of the missions. And if I cite my colleague from the Slovenian MFA, as long as strategic problems and operational level in CSDP are kept separate, until then it is not expected for to achieve progress at the operational level or influence the overall reform of CSDP. So when both missions were planned and started, they raised huge expectations, especially EULEX. And that proved to be quite a problem afterwards, because they really couldn't build on those huge expectations. And it was also relevant for EU's self-perception as a foreign and security actor. So if I just move now to some lessons learned from both missions, what we actually listed as success indicators. Both missions were preceded by other missions. So in the case of EULEX, that was UNMIC, and in the case of EUFOR Althea, that was by I4, S4, so NATO's operation. And we actually assessed that as a good thing, that EU was building on the actions of other organizations beforehand. For example, in Bosnia's case, S4's operational plans were already in place and formed the basis for EUFOR strategic and operational planning. But what came afterwards, because this sort of handover from the NATO's missions to the EU was assessed as quite simple, even though the negotiations between NATO and EU took quite a long time. And if you take into consideration that actually NATO's military state in the place and changed then just the name of the mission to the EU. It took like 9 months for all the documents within the EU to be adopted. And all the later reconstruction of the mission, because the mandate was adapted, I think 4 times, was driven primarily by the lack of political will by the member states and also withdrawal of the participating nations. The first mandate in EULEX, which was sort of covering 3 components, police, justice, and customs, was restructured in 2012 into strengthening an executive component, and that was assessed actually as a very good thing for the future implementation of the project. So in the case of EULEX, there was a EU planning team deployed beforehand, and that also seems as a very good practice for the future EU missions, because it provided local presence on the ground. It could sort of interact with the locals a bit more. And it was also, it helped with recruitment and deployment of staff at these initial phases. What is interesting actually is that the first operational plan of EULEX is different from the last document that EUPT proposed, which is probably because of member states' interventions and their political interests. So in the case of EUFOR Althea, thank you, EU has a special agreement for EUFOR and can use some of the NATO structures related to communication and information system, access to NATO classified network, intelligence system, etc., etc. What is a bit worrying that when we spoke to the people in the mission, they perceive that the EU mission is actually, because it has a very complicated sort of strategic level, how NATO and EU jointly lead it, that it's perceived as much more NATO-led than EU-led, and NATO is perceived as much better at strategic planning than the EU is. And in the case of EULEX, it's also important to stress that the EU was able to find a political compromise and deploy the mission despite the challenges arising from the question of Kosovo status. In both cases, we realized that there's a well-elaborated mission analysis of lessons learned. However, the implementation of those lessons learned is not the best. Okay, so if I just move quickly to some of the challenges, I would just like to mention a couple of them. One is EU visibility. I think somebody was mentioning before that EU has a lot of tools available. So what people stressed is that, for example, in Bosnia, probably the population is not really aware that there's an EU mission in that military camp. They still feel that there's a NATO mission. And in the case of Kosovo, they said that EU has too many actors on the ground because there's a special representative, it's EULEX, then there's development assistance, people are just mixing what EU is doing and what. In both cases, a really huge challenge is a lack of clear end state or exit strategy, if we can say so. But that's also the result of political deliberation by the member states because the mandates are very, very vague. So, for example, somebody said if somebody wanted to achieve what's in EULEX's mandate, EULEX should stay there for 20 years, and nobody knows if it's even possible to achieve all that on the ground. So we saw there's a bit animosity present from the field level to the Brussels level, because the field level says Brussels level lacks situational awareness on the ground. And what I also realized that there's some animosity on the level member states, Brussels as well. Yeah. So also in the case of EULEX, it seems like CPCC is understaffed because in Brussels you have in the structures 2 people dealing with such a huge mission as EULEX. And that's why things take a lot of time to be processed within CPCC, etc. So administrative procedures take too long. The strategic reviews are perceived as highly politicized, so they say they're not reflecting the real situation on the ground, and that's why people also feel reporting is often mismatched with discussions in Brussels and also reports from the ground. They do not have a desired impact in Brussels. Okay, there was also, just one more minute, there was an issue with the pre-deployment training because people stressed a couple of times, member states are not deploying their best staff, this staff is not trained well, and this is causing a lot of issues within the mission. And also a problem is this constant rotation of staff, because usually when somebody comes new to the mission, they need at least 2 months to become really operational and understand what's going on. And just a couple of remarks. We feel there is maybe not, as general conclusions, not enough conditionality in CSDP mission. This extensive political approval process is a real showstopper. Lessons learned are not taken on board, and also CSDP was generally intended to serve as a rather short-term instrument, but in the case of both missions, it turned into a very long-term ones, and that doesn't probably work too well as well. I would stop here. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Ms. Boštjančič Pulko for her presentation of this research, and maybe the panelists could have seen some notes that I've been sending during your presentation. So these notes would just mark 3 minutes left for your presentation, so we can keep up with the time and leave enough time for the discussion. Next panelist with us today is Annemarie Peen Rodt from the Institute for Strategy, Royal Danish Defense College, and she's going to present research titled EU Conflict Prevention and Peacebuilding in the Western Balkans and Horn of Africa, What is Missing? I yield the floor to Ms. Peen Rodt.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to the Belgrade Center. The Belgrade Center for Security Policy has done an extraordinary job preparing this, and I think that deserves a nod here from me as well. So thank you very much to you. Also thank you to the EU, our funders, right? We sometimes forget to mention this, but I think it is worthy of mentioning, in particular, when we're talking about issues like what we are today, because we have throughout the day already heard about individual research projects as well as 3 big EU-funded Horizon 2020 projects, which are research projects funded by the European Union under the call to identify best practices and lessons learned within this field, how the EU best prevents and responds to conflict. And I think that's important actually to acknowledge, because it is one way in which the European Union is putting, literally, its money where its mouth is. So hopefully we are living up to some of those expectations. But I think it is worth noting, because it shows an interest and an investment from the EU side in trying to identify some of the things that work, some of the things that don't work, and eventually trying to learn from it. And I think I speak on behalf of all 3 projects when I say there is actually very much an interest in Brussels to hear what we are finding in these projects, because there is very much an awareness that resources are limited and the challenge is huge. So let me start by noting that. Okay, I am talking here today as a representative, one of many representatives of the EU CivCap project that you've heard about from colleagues throughout the day. And I think we are falling into a trap that lots of people who deal with the EU do. We talk in abbreviations. So let me start by just reminding you what the EU CivCap actually is. This project is basically a response to a European Union request to investigate how the EU prevents and responds to conflicts. And we look in particular at civilian capabilities for sustainable peace. Okay, so that's the frame within which we work. And as I said, you've met a number of team members already, but we are many. We've been working on this for 3 years. There are 9 work packages in the project, of which I'm only presenting one. So I think that's worth mentioning, in particular also because our consortium leader, Anna Jonkos, has only been able to join us this evening, unfortunately, and I think Bristol, represented by Gilberto over in the corner, also deserves a nod. Okay, so let me just, before I go into what I'm here to present, refer you also to the project webpage, where you can find all of these reports we keep talking about, because we, of course, have very little time to present our main findings. But on the webpage you can find both all of our research results, the reports, but also the events that are hosted. Right, enough of the advertising. The work package that I lead in the CivCap project is perhaps too sexily called Execute. But it is basically about how we do EU conflict prevention, how we do peace building. Okay, it's about the execution of these types of activities, which is why you have heard a lot of focus throughout the day on implementation. We focus on the 2 regions, the Western Balkans and the Horn of Africa. And the report that I have submitted for this panel is deliverable 5.1 in the project, which is on the implementation process of what basically Michael Smith was talking about this morning. The way in which we approach this, and I should say, again, 9 researchers have been part of writing this report, so I'm up here to take the flak, but the credit is certainly very much a team effort. But Mike this morning basically said there are 2 opportunity areas for the EU in this realm. Okay, one is regional security, and the second is crisis response. And that's been the starting point for this report. So what we do is we look at the implementation of EU conflict prevention and peace building in these 2 regions, the Western Balkans and the Horn of Africa, through a regional lens. We look at it as regional security and as crisis response, because we, equally to what Michael was saying this morning, see this as really opportunity areas for the European Union. What we then do is basically to take what in research terms is called a structured, focused, comparative approach to the notion of effectiveness. So we look at what the EU does, mapping out the activities, yes, but also looking at whether this is actually effective in terms of operational conflict prevention and peace building. We take a 2-pronged approach, as Eric mentioned in the previous panel, where on the one hand we look at the internal EU perspective. What is the EU setting out to do? And does it achieve what it sets out to do? Combining that with an external conflict perspective, where we look at what is conflict prevention in operational terms, and is that actually what we're doing? So not necessarily just saying, okay, the EU is doing lots of activities, these are going well or not so well, but also linking it back to, but is that actually conflict prevention? Are we actually building peace? And the final part of the approach that we take is that we look at the means that the EU uses, the approach that the EU takes, as well as what it achieves, the goals that it sets out. Now, the report itself has a number of different parts, and I won't go into too much detail about it because, of course, you will all be rushing to read it, right? But what we start by doing is to set out, well, what are the EU strategies for these two regions? What are the CSDP engagements that are specifically developed and implemented for this purpose in both regions? The next section of the report then holds that up against a regional conflict analysis. So if we try to understand the security situation in the Horn of Africa as a regional conflict complex, what does that look like? And does what the EU is doing actually match what is needed to resolve that conflict complex? Same is done for the Western Balkans. The next section of the report is then a comparative case study looking into two specific missions, the one being the European Union Rule of Law mission in Kosovo. We've heard lots about EULEX already. And the second one being the EU Maritime Security Capacity Building mission in Somalia. And I don't want to take too much time, so let me just summarize a few of the findings that haven't already been mentioned in other panels. Because as you will have seen, we've dealt with these missions from different perspectives already. But one thing that I think is important to note is that if you look at the conflicts, or the regional conflict complex in the Western Balkans, thank you, and in the Horn of Africa, they are not actually so different, right? Our starting point is usually, well, the Balkans and the Horn of Africa, you know, apple and pears, are they even both fruit? But if we look at it from a conflict studies perspective, if we look at the causes and the characteristics of these types of conflicts, they're not so different. There are similar tendencies. There are similar root causes. There are similar consequences. And so where I would propose to you they are very different is in the conflict cycle, at the stage of the conflict cycle that we're at in the two regions. Very different. The intensity of the violence or the conflict, the violent conflict, is completely different in the Horn of Africa and the Western Balkans. So we need to clarify when we're talking about this what it is that we're looking at. Because those similarities, the understanding of what type of conflict this is, Peter talked about it this morning, that we are looking at a specific type of internal conflicts that have regional consequences. Well, if we understand that the problem is actually similar, it's the intensity and the stage at which we're at that's the difference, then that is actually reflected in the EU strategy. The EU understands that, and it appreciates that, and that materializes then in the way in which the EU engages. That, I think, is a positive. If you look at the EU's engagement in the Western Balkans at present, it is about economic development, it's about democratic governance, it's about rule of law. It's about post-conflict issues, which are, of course, also conflict prevention, right? It's a cycle. We call it a cycle because there is a danger that even post-conflict can become renewed conflict, right? If we then look at Horn of Africa, well, then the EU response is counter-piracy, counter-terrorism. It's instead of addressing causes of conflict, the EU is still addressing consequences of conflicts. And so I think what that shows us is the range of tools we heard about earlier today that the EU has developed and deployed, and also the range of, or the different types of engagement that the EU has. So there are some counterintuitive, and I would propose to you interesting findings in this. Because if we then look at the two missions, and I'll finish on this point. Well, then EULEX started out really well, right? It was the flagship. It was initially a success, but as we've heard over and over again today, it is increasingly a disappointment. Whereas EUCAP, equally ambitious, perhaps some would say even more ambitious, but somehow it seems better received, even though we've just, I'll take your silence as an agreement, we've just agreed, right, that the challenge in the Horn of Africa is even bigger. So I think that tells us two things. Well, first of all, the model is the right one. We need to look at both the ends, the goals of these types of endeavors, but also the means by which we try to respond. And that brings me to the final point, namely that the way in which the EU responds is perhaps where the challenge lies. Because what the EU, it seems to me or to us, that the EU has done better in the Horn of Africa at present than what it is currently doing in EULEX, is that it was flexible. Its response on the ground was flexible to the challenge at hand. Whereas what seems to be happening in EULEX is that it's stagnating. So I think I'll finish on this point and really encourage all of you to please engage with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we are very happy to share ours as well. Thank you.
I would like to thank Ms. Peen Rodt for presenting this research and as well as the research project in this overall context. We will move on to our next and last panelist, and I would like to yield the floor to Mr. Alaa Tartir of Geneva Center for Security Policy to present the paper titled "The EUPOl COPS Operations in Palestine, Aiding and Abetting Authoritarianism?" ?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here, and congratulations on organizing such an inspiring and intellectually stimulating forum. Maybe to start with Annemarie, as I'm still not running an EU-funded project, so maybe I will be a bit more critical, if that is possible. And in this brief intervention, I would like to raise 5 main points, if time allows, or 5 main conclusions, or observations, or arguments, if you want, to problematize the role of the EU police mission in Palestine, and also to assess the consequences of that intervention. And in this intervention, my intervention in this case, I will be wearing 2 hats, one academic and one policy hat. And I will change them when needed, so when you hear me saying the EU should, then that is my policy hat. And I will continue the journey and bringing you to the Middle East in this case, and in particular to the easiest spot, Palestine, Israel. It is so easy that, I would like to engage with you in an 11 years old police mission, which makes it the longest ongoing civilian crisis management of the EU, which by itself tells you that the EU is happy with it. This is why it is gone for that long. The purpose of this EU police mission, which is called EUPOl COPS, is quite straightforward, which is to professionalize the Palestinian police force as a prerequisite for peace and state building, but also to engage in the process of the so-called peace process through an additional investment in security sector reform project. And the easy conclusion that we can already come to is that neither peace nor state are close. And therefore, if we understand it in a very linear way, then this implies that there is a failure to be acknowledged there. But we all know that the process is a bit more complicated than that. So while there are so many similarities between the case of Palestine and the other cases just discussed earlier, there is one major, unfortunate uniqueness for the case of Palestine, which is the existence and continuation of the Israeli military occupation that in this case hinders the operations of the EU and negatively impact the effect of its police mission. And this continuation of the Israeli occupation add another level of complexity, and therefore the question of whose security is not that easy to answer. It is quite more difficult with that level of additional complexity that we have. So in this regard, my first argument and message is that when this big elephant in the room is dismissed somehow, or sidelined as if it belongs to the other stories, then all the good intentions, best strategies, and most professional interventions will not change the fact that the effectiveness of the EU police mission will be at really completely different level if that occupation does not exist, especially that that occupation is the main source of insecurity for the Palestinian and Palestinian people. So the question that we need to raise in this regard is what exactly a professional and effective local policing mean in a context where foreign military occupation exists, and whose security is of concern. And by extension then, what does security sector reform even mean when there is an absence of statehood and sovereignty? There are some theoretical questions that we can raise using this case of Palestine. And so far, the EU policymakers are still failing to address these questions sufficiently, I would argue. So this is from the first point related to the Israeli side, but the second point relates to the type of Palestinian institutions and style of governance that the EU is creating, reforming, and nourishing. And I'm saying here the EU is creating and reforming and nourishing because Europe is the biggest donor to the Palestinian Authority. And arguably even we can say if without European money, the Palestinian Authority won't exist now. And that's a big statement. But the problem of that money that totaled to almost $30 billion over the last 24 years is that currently, or over the last 10 years, 30% of that money goes to security sector, to the Palestinian security sector that does not particularly provide security for the Palestinian people. And does not provide that security despite the fact that we're talking about having around 83,000 security personnel working in that security sector. But instead, this security establishment and these security arrangements are securing a flawed peace process that gives priority and of the security to the others, but not to the Palestinians. And this is a big context that we need to keep in mind when we discuss security as far as Palestinians are concerned. But to add another twist maybe to the story, particularly over the last 10 years, this European-sponsored state-building project of the Palestinian Authority was in a nutshell a security sector reform project. It was not really fully fledged on state-building project, and this is why the EU police mission is particularly interesting and particularly important to illustrate the creation and the emergence of a paradigm that I call securitization of everything. There's a securitized peace process, there is a securitized development process, securitized spaces, securitized peace negotiations, securitized economic approaches, etc., etc. So everything became to be securitized, yet security is absent. And that first, or security first approach, if you want to call it like that, has been adopted, but since then security conditions, especially for the Palestinian people, did not improve. And this tension needs to be resolved somehow. So instead, I argue that what happened is that simply security was, or became, to mean stability. And when we equate between security and stability, then we do have a problem. Because stability within the existing dynamics there means sustainability of the status quo, which basically does not bode any well for peace process and meaningful long-term arrangement. So this security first approach meant basically that the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian security forces became the most influential actor as far as Palestinian governance is concerned. And when security establishment leads, then, especially in that part of the world, we all should be worried, because then this means some authoritarian trends, some police state formation, and so on. And unfortunately, this worry became a nightmare, or became a reality, especially over the last 10 years, as part of the state building project in Palestine, which is sponsored by European money largely, became a reality. And we started witnessing more authoritarian transformation of the Palestinian side, and then the policing establishment of the Palestinians start ruling with an iron fist. And this whole process was sponsored, approved, supported by the EU and the European actors. And therefore, what I argue here is that what the EU did through its police mission in the occupied Palestinian territory is basically what I call a professionalization of authoritarianism. And this professionalization of authoritarianism can be illustrated in so many different ways, not only through working in the absence of parliament, in the absence of checks and balances institutions, no democratic participatory approaches, with human rights violations, with criminalization of resistance as part of the package of security sector reform. The list is really long. And the EU and its police mission are directly and indirectly involved in these processes. And this is why I'm a bit more critical. Although they are engaged with that through the umbrella of effective policing and good governance. So there is a tension there between good governance and authoritarianism that still to be acknowledged. So, and this Palestinian authoritarianism is particularly worrying in this regards, because within the overall colonial setting, the entrenchment of the Palestinian authoritarianism translates to basically explicit and implicit sustainability of the Israeli occupation and colonial regime. And this is the cycle that we live in. So that was the Israeli side, the Palestinian side, and thirdly, the European mission itself, which is still stuck behind a pure technical mandate, although it works in a highly politicized context, which is problematic, to say the least. And whenever I ask the personnel in the mission any question that is not really for their liking, they said, listen, we're only purely technical. We cannot address these questions. Your questions are very, very political. And I only ask about transparency. I always ask about good governance. I ask about the core issues that they have to deal with. But then they deem to be very political, which means that they are in love with this technical mandate and really terrified of politics. And I do have a problem with that, because this means that the EU is really interested in a part of the story, not all the story. So they are interested to see the party, but not to know what happened later on after that party. And that's really problematic, because this technical intervention has very clear political ramifications and consequences that the EU and its mission decided just to ignore as if they are not happening. And they are turning a blind eye for this obvious political ramifications. So this takes me to the fourth point, which is precisely because of this, already 3 minutes? Cool. Which takes me precisely due to this technical understanding and mandate, there is another tension to raise, which is the gap, but it's a different sort of gap. It's a gap between the authorities and the elite, be it Palestinian or Israeli or European, who thinks that this was a major success, and between the people, the end users, the people who are supposed to be secured because of this. And the gap is very big and starking. And And that, from ownership point of view, I also raise an issue here, because for me, local ownership also means serving the end users in this case, which is the Palestinian people themselves, not to completely marginalize them. But the elites thinks quite differently. From the people, from like the voices of the people that I interviewed during the multiple fieldwork, a different story really emerged. And that story is a story of another level of oppression and human security. And the views really varies from a particular stream of these views that saw the police mission as a third occupation, after the Israeli, the Palestinian, and then this is a third one, or seeing this police mission as highly technocratic body that want to transform the self-determination struggle and project into simply a bureaucracy. And transforming a project of self-determination to a bureaucracy was an issue that many respondents from the people had an issue with. So I would say that the EU policymakers should take note of this clear gap and clear tension if they really want to see positive impact for their intervention, not only for the Palestinian people, but also to the prospect and idea of peace. And as I do have 2 minutes, so I will just present one quote that I always find quite amusing related to this. And this is one respondent in the West Bank who, and I'm quoting here, said, "The US security mission is the big and aggressive devil. The European security mission is the small and gentle devil. Both of them are devils, but packaged differently." So if we think about what does that mean, it means the lack of people-centric approaches. It means lack of locally owned accountabilities and mechanisms. So if all this reflection appeared to be harsh, I'm sorry, but it is because of what we mentioned earlier, the expectations are high. And maybe I would expect all this from an American intervention, but maybe not from a European intervention. And so, and why I'm not focusing on the good things, and there are many good things that we can discuss in the Q&A, I'm focusing on these things because I really care about the big project and about the big picture, where effectively what's been going on here is a process of Palestinian state deformation instead of formation. So finally, and this is the real finally one, is in a forthcoming publication I have with Filip there, and inspired by the voices of the people from the ground or ordinary citizens, we ask and wonder in one of these publications if the EU and its police mission are living on Mars. And in some respect, and unfortunately they are. And this is not an exaggeration to say so. But this, again, should worry all of us, because if we really want to have an EU as an effective global actor, then we have a problem there. And building a common future, which is the theme of this project, requires that all of us live on the same planet. And we just have one planet that we really need to make better. And if they're still living on Mars, then we have a problem with that. And therefore, there is one question that remains to be answered, which is, when will the EU start addressing the problems from the root causes and not only deal with the symptoms of the issues? And the security dimension is at the core of these issues. I will stop here and we'll continue in Q&A. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Tartir for this interesting presentation and explaining more about the context, local context of the role of these particular operations. And now, without further ado, and with having in mind that after this session, we will have the Salus Award ceremony, which marks also the best policy papers written by the students of the University of Belgrade. I think we can maybe use about 6 minutes for presentation, for the comments of our discussant, and maybe have small discussion, and then we can continue in this same session with the ceremony awards. If that is the case, then I yield the floor to Mr. Vladimir Ateljević to discuss on these papers.
Thank you very much, Marko. It seems to me that it would have been much easier to run like a Forrest Gump than to find a lot of critical points to share with my colleagues and to add something substantial. I would therefore, Annemarie said that it's sometimes when dealing with you about the abbreviation, sometimes said it's about KISS, and I'll keep it short and simple. Basically, I have 3 points, and I will try to sum up. If we want to have, in my humble opinion, the EU as a successful global player, I think we have to answer to the 3 main questions. The first one would be, why do we go with, by we, I mean the European Union, and pardon my EU citizens fellows, coming from Serbia, I think a country that is also joining the EU missions and operations abroad. There has to be a strong reasoning, and I would try to offer 3, which I also researched in previous years. Second question is, where do we go? Not only in terms of the final destination, but the final end goal and end state. And the third one is, who is in the driving seat? We have heard about it, but also who are the passengers? And I will draw here on some of the Filip's conclusions, because we have seen that sometimes passengers are not only in the back seat, but unfortunately in another car. So starting from the very first one, why do we go? What is the strong reason behind the EU's involvement? And I found 3 main reasons of such, and I believe this is the easiest question. The first one is, I'd say, current, if not the immediate security challenge, risk or threat to the EU. And we can see that how the EU reacted in Mediterranean, for example, or how for the first time the mutual assistance clause was invoked in the case of fight against terrorism. So these were the really immediate reasons for the EU to react, and it reacted in some of these cases very successfully. The second one is the particular national or commercial interest, and Filip explained it. The reason why the EU actually sent the vessel protection and shipments mission in the Horn of Africa. But also we have learned that there are a lot of national interests which are also at stake, and if we analyze all of the missions through the Africa continent, we can find a lot of missions where, for example, France is in lead. And we have there some good and bad experiences. Remember Chad, 2008. We have learned that France borne more than 80% of costs, but we have learned also that it heavily relied on somebody else's capacities. It was the Russian one and the helicopters in terms of the air transport tactique, which was necessary to be used. And the first, maybe the most legitimate one, and this is how some would remember from the European security strategy, the effective multilateralism was born. And this is the EU in a wider global context, basically going together with the UN, with the strong ground in the chapters 7 and 8 of the UN Charter. So this is really the one of the 3, I find, strong reasons for the EU to react. Then, where do we go? And some of my predecessors said the end state is extremely important, defining concretely what the end state should be for each and every mission. But also before that, where do we go? What is the final destination? Because then we face different political realities. One political reality is coming from Brussels, which has to find a consensus within the institutions and brought the realities from the capitals. Not every colleague from the MFA in Finland would find interesting to send his colleague to Mali mission, which is quite contrary to colleagues from France, again. And then, definitely the third point, this is the ground one, the local owners. This is the wholly different political reality, but not only political, I would say there is even more room than for the politics for sociologists, psychologists to actually analyze what the real local needs are. what the mentalities we are dealing with. We are dealing wholly another things in Balkans, unlike in Africa. And this has not been analyzed too much in some previous years. And then the end state. How we define the end state. What is it? Is it a political settlement of dispute? Is it finding a sustainable settlement of dispute? Or I think it was Annemarie who said addressing root cause. More important even when we deal with migration management, extremely important one. Or the EU can be mostly successful if it finds the best area of expertise where it can really contribute. With defining this end state, I would bear on what our experience is. It's kind of paradoxical that the EU shows more scrutiny when the rule of law is about towards candidates. And Sonia will help me, I guess, in the area of rule of law and chapters 23 and 24, which is good, which is very good. But how the end state should be defined according to these action plans, with all of the indicators that had to be measurable, with all of the measures that had to be well planned. This is something how we can learn the end state in missions would be also defined, and how EU can self-assess itself. Either in these chapters 23 and 24, you have made to cut the numbers in backlogs of cases, or you didn't do it. We can invoke something similar, even I strongly believe in this area as well. And coming to our last question, who is in the driving seat? I would fully adhere to those who basically said that the EU was very successful if using the operational capabilities and assets of NATO. And we have learned in a number of missions that. But also, when it's about the political legitimacy, then the wider UN framework was a very good example. So bringing to a reality one of the major principles in the EU global strategy, and this is multilateralism. We need to think how it's really working. And I believe that the EU has to exploit something that wasn't exploited that much in the past. And this is defining the EU as an integrative power between different, sometimes even conflicting international actors, being international organizations or even the states. Also, who is in that car as a passenger means also who are the experts we are sending to. And I can draw one conclusion from the moment I was professionally born 15 years ago, and it was in the area of EU integration. The first expert I dealt with, I won't mention the country, maybe some of my colleagues would remember. It was in the area of the integration, and the guy was about to define the needs in improving the institutions for coordination of EU integration. And his professional background was that he was artillery colonel. And at least he had two problems. I had to speak loud, and I had to speak to his right ear, I believe, because the left one was next to the cannon. But also he was never dealing with the EU integration as such. And he brought the audit report with the needs that how we have to develop further with this coordination. This is something we have to avoid. And this also is a lesson learned for Serbia that is currently trying really to establish a new system, learn from all these experiences, and to establish the system for coordination and improving basically the civilian capabilities and the capabilities of Serbia to include itself in this sort of crisis management mission. And maybe the final point comes as a defensive one. I really believe Filip wrote an excellent article. Nothing too much to add, but I would try to be more maybe defensive towards the EU, because sometimes EU needs to be more pragmatic in working with the locals. If there is an end state well defined, then pragmatically going towards that end state could bring good results at this point. But this does not mean that it should not improve. I hardly can find any other, maybe apart from UN, but hardly I can find any other international organization that could really work in bringing or addressing root cause, bringing different but important values than the EU. And with this, I would like to conclude, of course, thanking very much to the organizers, the founding ladies, Sonja is here, but Marko Savkovic as well, for organizing this Academia BSF. This is really, believe me, one of the first and foremost important resort for the applied scientist. This is something which we really need a lot in these years and in the upcoming days and years. And thank you very much for organizing it.
I would like to thank Mr. Ateljević for these comments, and I believe now we have some time for questions and comments from the audience. So I think we may allow, let's say, 3 or 4 questions, so the panelists can quickly answer. So, please.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Rodt. So for the 3rd time, I think I heard today that EULEX is a failed mission. EU mission. So I'm just wondering, because if we listen to the discussion in the UN Security Council, we can also hear one side that is saying that EU mission should be terminated, and the other side which is saying that the mission should stay. So my question is, do you think that it should return to the EU to improve the EU mission, EULEX, or to terminate it? That is one question. And I saw that you have here one paper, article, Self-Determination After Kosovo. So I just want the conclusion of that paper. Is the Kosovo the unique case or precedent, and regarding the situation in Catalonia? Thank you.
So I believe we may go question by question, so please.
Annemarie?
I'm taking a minute because that's a big question to answer quickly. I think I have to start with the final question first, because that's the one on my mind. What you're referring to is a special issue on the question of self-determination after Kosovo. So basically what we did was a collaborative research project across Europe and Central Asia, looking at when Kosovo declared its independence, what did that mean in other areas where there were self-determination claims. And to do it very briefly, what we found was that the reaction wasn't the same everywhere. So the hypothesis we had is Kosovo declares independence. It is widely, although not universally, recognized. Will that then make other places declare independence? And what we found was that it wasn't quite so simple. There were actually very different strategies post-Kosovo. And I'm no expert on Catalonia, so let me say that up front, but I think what is interesting in what we are seeing unfold, which is very much, I mean, I'm sure we were all watching it last night, it's unfolding at the moment. But what is interesting about, to me at least, about what's happening with Catalonia is a declaration of the right to self-determination, but also with that going hand in hand is a dialogue approach. And I think that's an interesting development, which I think can be linked to the experience of Kosovo. So that's as brief as I can do it, but I would love to talk more to you about it. And with regard to EULEX, the word I used was disappointment rather than failure, because I think we need to be careful about always talking about this dichotomy of success and failure when we talk about missions. Instead, I think it is necessary to unpack both what these missions achieved, but also the way in which it has achieved what it has done. And the reason why I mention that is relevant in particular to EULEX, because it has had significant achievements. But some of its biggest problems has been because of the way in which its personnel have behaved, right? So this shows exactly, this is an example of exactly why it matters, not only what you do, but also how you do it. So like much of this panel, actually, I think it's a question of glass half full, glass half empty. But I think and now I'm speaking for myself rather than the entire research team, wouldn't call EULEX a failure, but rather a disappointment, because I think it has had also some significant achievements. Thanks.
Just make one comment, and of course I would not do it on the status issues. This is for the politics, but maybe for this panel. What I find as one of the problems with the EULEX mission is that the whole box of tools is somehow disconnected, because we are speaking here a lot of the different processes on the one similar issue. And if we just take as an example rule of law, we have the EULEX mission, which is on the rule of law. We have the process of the Brussels dialogue, which is partly on the rule of law, and the communities which also are there as the negotiators and the local owners. Then we have had the visa-free process, where, again, the very important part of this process is rule of law. And the fourth one is the overall process of monitoring of the advance of the society towards within the European integration framework. And now we are speaking about a whole bunch of different tools, how we can bring them together. I would always bear, and my best experience is always working with the European Commission, and the set of standards that the European Commission, when it's about the competencies of the Commission, can easily work with then when the high politics is interfered. But somehow we have to mitigate these different processes on the same issue.
Thank you. We've had 1-2 questions, so please.
Thank you. My name is Kristina Miletic. I work at the Global Partnership for Prevention of Armed Conflict on the VOSCA project, which is one of Horizon 2020 projects that was mentioned. And I have a question for Filip. So you mentioned that the EU starts its mission following commercial interests and doesn't take into account local interests. And Vladimir also underlined that the local interests are crucial. So my question is, what would be your recommendation, or one of them, towards the EU on how to ensure that local needs are heard and included in the design of the EU missions?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Well, to start with, I think the EU should include the local stakeholders in the design phase of CSDP missions, not in the implementation phase. Currently, the EU, due to a number of political but also bureaucratic reasons, decides, negotiates the mandate of a potential mission among the member states, and then they go to the host state and then they try to sell the mission and responsibilize the locals for whatever the objectives of the missions are. So my first advice would be to involve the locals in the design phase. Bring them to Brussels, travel not only on a 1-week fact-finding mission that spans a continent size of Africa and try to speak to like one civil society representative who is cherry-picked from the capital usually, one member of the government which is usually not in charge much beyond the capital, and few other people, but rather conduct a thorough fact-finding mission and involve the locals in the design phase. That's one thing. In the context of the Horn of Africa, there is a clear, need to maybe move away from the piracy issue and to integrate other tasks and objectives which are relevant for the locals. And here I think, first and foremost, for instance, illegal fishing. This is what Somalis care about, illegal fishing, first and foremost. Then, by the way, illegal fishing is mostly conducted by European flagged ships, which is another, paradox in the entire, okay, not only from the EU, also from Yemen and from other countries, but in terms of size of the fish which is taken from the Somali coast, it's usually the European flagfish boats. Then also to include other tasks and objectives which are relevant for the locals, such as illegal waste dumping. Again, it's usually powerful Western states who simply dump their, in some cases, even nuclear waste on the Somali shore, because there is no coast guard and Somalia is a failed state, and you can do it unpunished. So that's another thing. Also migration, arms trafficking, human trafficking, issues which are important for the local population and to the local authorities. Instead of focusing on, and by the way, the EU mission has moved slightly in that direction since the last strategic revision. So going back to Nicola's point, the EU is learning, but I think it's too little, too late.
I think we can allow 2 more questions, one here and one to the gentleman in the second row. Yes, so first question, yes.
Hi, my name is Donika from Kosovo Center for Security Studies, currently also working with the EU Institute for Security Studies. Well, there has been a lot of discussions about EULEX, and what I've heard from this panel, I got this perception that we mostly talk about the EU needs. When do we start the mission? Why do we start the mission? What do we benefit from it? But not what is the interest of the recipient country. And that goes back to what Filip said, that the concept of local ownership. You have to include the locals when you design this strategy. Well, in the case of UNMIC, they couldn't do it because the situation was different. But in the case of EULEX, they could have easily done, because by that time, Kosovo had a very consolidated EU law enforcement and institutions, but they didn't do so. The other point that I want to talk about is when you go to a country, in the case of EULEX, it was not just interacting with the locals that actually would have boosted the success of the mission, but also coordination with other missions, existing missions. And I'm not talking about UNMIC only, because UNMIC was withdrawing by that time, although it's still active in Kosovo. But we are talking about ISITAP, a American project that is deeply rooted into the Ministry of Internal Affairs, where the EULEX also has interest to be working with. And then you have OSCE closely working with the police. So basically, now in Kosovo, I just have a perception that there are 3 actors, totally discoordinated, not knowing which actor to actually approach in the local level, and they are just confused, and sometimes they are competing with each other. And then you have ISITAP with the American approach, and then you have the EULEX with total different European approach. That is also a very huge problem. And then the experts. That brings me to the level of experts. The turnover is 1 or 2 years, mostly 3 years. Those who come to Kosovo, they lack basic information about the region, not just the country. The moment they start learning about the country, they go. And then someone else comes. And then we will have to work for 3 more years actually trying to settle them down and then manage to cooperate with them. And this brings me to my question. I mean, there is going to be EULEX for another 2 years. I don't know how. They are still trying to find their identity. Is it going to be within the EU office in Kosovo? Or how do you actually plan to make this mission, make up for the, from what has been happening from 2008 till now, within 2 years, and is it going to be a success? I mean, are you at least planning to convince the general public opinion in Kosovo and the EU that actually it's worth the money that has been spent in Kosovo for almost a decade?
Thank you. Maybe we can have the last question, and then we can collect the 2 and then have the answers combined.
Okay, thank you. I don't need a mic, but it's okay.
I worked at the European Commission 2006-13 in charge of the region, so I know the EULEX mission pretty well. Not from the inside, but at least from cooperating with the mission. There are 2 points I'd like to add. Maybe the one that you just mentioned. And I think we should make a difference between police and customs, which I think have been a success. Why? Because in a sense, I don't want to offend any police officer or customs officer here, but they are largely, do you say that in English, interchangeable? You know, the rule book, the best practice manual, whatever. You know, Italian police officer is leaving, a German is coming, okay, they would follow the same, basically the same rules. But building up a judiciary system, that's completely different. And two points here, the one that was just mentioned, the turnover. So there were many cases, tens of cases of prosecutors coming from one of the member states for, 1, 2, 3 years. But after 6 months, the prosecutor is offered a much better job if he comes from Bordeaux to Paris. Would he stay in Kosovo? Of course not, he leaves. Another one is coming. He has to go again through the files and etc. So the turnover has been absolutely disastrous. And second, one of the rare persons to say that, the executive power. I think it was a big mistake to give to an external mission like EULEX the right to decide, not just to advise, to train, monitor, whatever, but to decide, to replace local prosecutors, local judges. Then afterwards, it's very easy when the Commission reports on corruption in Kosovo, the Prime Minister can easily say, come on, you've been in charge for several years. Why didn't you make sure that, situation would improve? And I think that's one of the big lessons to learn from the mission. Thank you.
The responses from the panel?
I think all I want to say from my or our side is that the points being raised, both of them, are very much in correspondence with our findings. So I would agree. I think I've managed to be positive. That was my. I felt the day needed a bit of a positive EU energy, but we certainly recognise exactly the challenges that have been put forward. But I think this distinction between the different areas in which EULEX has been working is an important one. And for the point just being made, I mean, these lessons were also lessons that we should have learned in Bosnia, right? We saw similar problematiques around the executive mandate of the OHR there.
There are any other responses? Yes, please.
I just wanted to stress that also EULEX has been a great lesson learned project for the EU, unfortunately. From what we have heard is that the executive component, the justice one, it's probably a mistake that should never be repeated again, but let's see what happens in the future. And also, since there is no really benchmarks and end state, so Kosovo mission ends when member states decide it's time to end it.
Just 2 quick notes on EULEX. One is related to executive, and I fully agree with the comments previously that was probably the biggest mistake, to try to substitute a local government with an international kind of authority. It rarely works, and in this case it didn't work at all. But I'm really curious to know on what ground an assessment or decision was made. Now, instead of transferring the authority to the Kosovar rule of law institutions to deal, however imperfectly, with the crimes against humanity, instead of doing that and use conditionality and other policy instruments to try to face the Kosovar society with the past, instead of that, you have a movement in a totally opposite direction. You have another international court, which is miraculously expected to succeed where UNMIK and EULEX have failed, and I haven't read one good argument why this will happen, why there is an expectation that this international tribunal, although it is formally Kosovar, but we all know what it is, right? Why there is an expectation it will succeed. And another point on EULEX, which refers to the issue, the whole issue of local ownership. I think that the EULEX has really misunderstood the whole notion of local ownership, and that the executive component was in a total violation of any sort of autonomy or the need or impulse to kind of responsibilize the locals in the way it should be. And yeah, with this I would stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the panelists for their very interesting, insightful, and very well-researched presentations, and for the opportunity that was given to us to hear those research results, as well as I would like to thank the audience for being patient with us in this after-lunch panel, which can be very difficult most of the times. So also thank you for your questions. And besides giving a round of applause to our panel, I would like to take the opportunity to now convey to the award ceremony for the Salos Award that is given, that is the best student papers in international security, that is going to be delivered right now. And then maybe we can close this panel together with the Salos after the award ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for being with us at the third panel. And with this, we close the academic event of the Belgrade Security Forum 2017. But nevertheless, this is not the last academic activity that we have at this year's forum. Tomorrow, starting at 4 p.m., we will have the Methods Cafe for the postgraduate and doctoral students who are interested in research methods. So feel free to stop by to one of these rooms, and we will have interesting discussions there as well. Thank you very much.